Happy Tuesday, or whenever you're watching this. I like to pretend it's the actual day of the class, even though obviously I'm recording this ahead of time and you're watching it whenever. So today, Tuesday, we're reading the introduction to a book called Measured Meals. And unfortunately, it's kind of one of the harder readings for the class. And I'm sorry about that. It would be nice to have a more of a warm-up period. But don't worry if it feels a little slippery in terms of what's going on. There'll be a lot of references you won't get. There's a lot of information that's kind of maybe too in the weeds. So I want to try to help, frame it here so you know what to focus on. The chapter focuses on it's an introduction to a book, and so she's talking about in this book I do this and this, and the point of the book is to focus on the implications of quantifying dietary advice. And we have a whole day on this, I think, in week 3. So we'll come back to the topic. And her general idea is that when we understand nutrition and diet and health through numbers and measurement and calories and nutrients and vitamins and tables and RDA allowances and so on, we're actually becoming less healthy because we're thinking about it in these numbers and not in a more holistic way. So we don't need to worry too much about the ideas about quantification right now, because we'll come back to that later in the mid 19th century when it becomes really dominant in the way we think about health. The reason we're reading it, though, is really important. It's a frame for the whole class. It gives us a really important sort of lesson and thing to think about we should keep in mind throughout the course, throughout every reading. And we read a lot of diet texts from different centuries, different eras, and it's important to know how to read them. And we'll talk about that as we get to those. But this is a really important thing to keep in mind from the beginning. She's trying to call attention to what she calls the rhetoric of science. And some of you have heard about rhetoric or studied it, maybe taken a class on it. Some of you are wondering what the heck that means. Rhetoric really is how you make someone believe what you're saying. How do you make arguments persuasive? It's the language they use, it's the evidence they emphasize, it's the tone they adopt, the assumptions they invite you to accept. And, very crucially, I think the way they frame the issue, the way they frame the question. This is, if you've ever been in debate club, you get really good at this. I like being in debate club. You learn not to answer the question as presented. You learn to frame it or skew it a little bit so that your answer is this clearly the superior one, right? So it's not about like which answer is better. It's how you frame it, right? And that's kind of what rhetoric is. It's how do we talk about it? So she's talking about how do we talk about science and medicine? What is the language we use? And it's overwhelmingly language of quantification. We saw this with the FDA definition of healthy, right? It's all numbers and tables and charts and so on. As we go through the readings, as we look at different kinds of historic dietary advice, when we read, we're not just thinking about what it says. We're not just thinking about what's the diet or what's the food or what's the thing you're not supposed to eat or whatever. We're not just interested in what they said. We're also interested in how did they say it? Why did they say it in that way? Why did they think it was going to sound convincing? What kind of person were they trying to appeal to? What kind of belief systems? What kind of morals? What kind of values seem to be bubbling up through the way they talk about diet? What do they do that makes it easier or harder to take seriously? Okay. And this can kind of sound obvious, but it's worth emphasizing again. There's no scientific facts that we get perfectly from research, whatever the topic is, right? There's this very difficult research that's hard to do in a laboratory, in whatever venue. And it doesn't just come magically in our brain, right? Somebody has to write up the research, describe it. Somebody has to read that, synthesize it with other stuff, and then write it into language that we can understand. If you want to know something about nutrition, you don't read nutrition articles. They're super impossible unless you know biochemistry and physiology and you know the jargon and all the terms. It's totally impenetrable if you're not in that field, right? So we depend on people to take that and make it make sense, so that average person can understand it and we know what the takeaway is, right? Eat more blueberries, eat less ice cream or whatever. And so the way that gets described, right, is super important. Like if you've ever played the telephone game, even after 4 or 5 people, the message is like completely different than what it started out as, right? It's, the way things get said transform the meaning. So these translators, right, of research have hugely important roles, right? So we have to choose who to believe and they have to convince people to believe them. So that's part of what we're studying in this class. And all of these experts, right, all of these authorities, they write with confidence, they make conclusions sound definitive, but that's almost always much more because of the rhetoric. It's because of their style. It's because of how they write more than the research, which is almost always a little bit ambiguous and a little bit wishy-washy and a little bit uncertain. And there's certain things we can take away from it. I'm not saying research doesn't help us understand the world, but it's far murkier than it often appears in the literature, right? Who wants to read a diet, article in some, some magazine where it's like, well, we did this research and it kind of suggested this, but it wasn't very strong. So really, I'm not sure. Man, take it or leave it. But here's what we learned. And it's this non-committal. Like nobody wants to read that. You want to read something that says if you eat this, you will have more energy. Right? You want this definitive conclusion. So people write that way, right? Because that's what consumers want. So there's this very imperfect translation from research to understanding, and that's part of how people have defined healthy food, healthy bodies, and so on. So again, her ideas about quantification are less important. Don't get too bogged down in that topic, because again, we come back to it, but really focus on her idea and her thoughts about paying attention to how we talk about diet, the rhetoric of science and medicine. And she makes a really strong claim, just a couple pages in, or maybe a couple paragraphs in, that quantification of diet is a failure. She's just, that's the sentence. I mean, it's really stark. And I hope you'll write about in your post for today how much you agree with that argument. What did she do? How was her rhetoric convincing or not convincing? You don't have to read and understand every detail to be able to show me that you're making an effort to understand this. Pick out some quotes, find some evidence, give some examples, relate some examples that she uses. It's really easy to show you're making an effort, even if a lot of it seems a little bit unclear to you. That's totally fine. That's how reading goes. You never know. You never have a clear picture of anything. So I want to know, how much do you agree with that? That quantification of diet has been a failure. So please have an informed opinion. Be familiar enough with the reading. You don't have to master every detail, but be familiar enough that you can make an informed argument. What points do you agree with? What specific claims were unsupported? Where was she most convincing, least convincing? Okay, you don't have to master the details to do that. So I look forward to your responses. Again, please don't use AI to shortcut the hard work of thinking. I'm not going to say this on every post, but it's the first week, so I'm kind of like, and I know not everyone watches the whole videos. And so, in case you skipped it the first time, there it is again. Use it to check for grammar, ask it questions. Am I missing anything? What else could I talk about? Use AI to help you learn. It's a great skill. I encourage it, but don't use it to generate your thinking for you. Otherwise, you don't learn how to do that, and you need it. It's really important. The human voice, human writing, human thinking is going to be even more valuable as more people kind of do stuff with AI. So I hope you'll embrace that challenge. Again, a little bit of a hard reading. Sorry, it's so early in the course. You'll get lost, but you can handle it. It's fine. Just keep reading. Don't give up. Okay, you'll get to a point, if you kind of keep slogging through, you get to a point where, oh yeah, you get back to the big picture. Okay, this is what she's talking about. Key in on that idea of rhetoric of science and health, how people are talking about it. Great frame for the rest of the class. Okay, see you next time.